how this made me feel. And so mediation is an opportunity for participants to have that face-to-face conversation with an officer. And it looks like a lot of different things. Sometimes people want to vent. Sometimes people want to ask questions and they have some clarity that they need about their situation. Sometimes people come up with really creative solutions to their specific situation, and also to situations that are beyond their individual circumstances, but more systemic. So the process really is meant to allow for a different form of accountability where it's not about the internal affairs board making an investigation and making a determination, but the actual participants who are involved in the conflict to own the conflict themselves and have the capacity to come up with their own solutions to the conflict. So it's more of a restorative justice model where it's less about the crime or the punishment and more about the harm that's been done and the relationships involved, and really giving folks a space to come up with their own solutions. So this slide is just kind of comparing the mediation process with that traditional investigation process, showing that on the left side, the mediation process is more collaborative. The participants are deciding on the outcome. The participants actually have an active role in the outcome rather than some third party deciding the discipline. And also they know the process that led to the outcome. So a lot of times residents were frustrated that they received this letter and they don't even know what went into the investigation. They don't know, what happened and how they came to that decision. And so this is a less adversarial, less top-down decision-making process. And like I said before, oftentimes folks just want to be heard. They just want a chance to speak and feel heard. And so that's where the mediation process can be very beneficial. So just a little bit about our process. We use a model called community mediation, the inclusive model of community mediation. And some of the key points of that model is that our process is voluntary. So officers and the civilians both agree voluntarily to participate. If folks do not want to participate, then they are not forced in any way, shape, or form to, and they can always choose to just have their complaint investigated in the traditional fashion. It's confidential, so what's said in the room stays in the room, and the only thing that's reported back is that the officers participated in good faith. That allows for officers to really be human at the table. It allows for participants to really say everything that they want to say and not be worried that somebody else is going to know about what happened in the room. Our mediators are non-judgmental, so there's lots of different models of mediation. Ours do not chime in about whether the conversation that's happening, is or isn't the right conversation. They're there to hold the space for the participants to have the conversation that they want to have. And all of the agreements that are made in the room are if people want to make agreements, are ones that the participants come up with themselves. So our model of mediation is not one where the mediators make any judgments about who's right or wrong. There's no evidence or witnesses needed, but people can bring evidence if they'd like. And like I said, the mediators themselves do not propose solutions. Interestingly, our model is also one where participants aren't forced to do anything or say anything that they don't want to. So it doesn't have to be a kumbaya moment. If the civilian wants to scream and yell, they can scream and yell. If they want to curse, they can curse. We don't, as mediators, force any type of specific communication. And everything is based on them voluntarily and consensually being there. So the mediators do make sure that the process is fair and that everyone's being heard and they're highly trained in dealing with the dynamics at the table. But it is a space where we don't ask people to follow any specific guidelines about communication. So I mentioned a little bit about this before, but the types of complaints that go to mediation are most often professionalism, discourtesy, and neglect of duty. Any complaint that has criminal allegations, especially things that involve use of force or something like unlawful search or any kind of sexual abuse. All of those would go through the traditional complaint process. So the kinds of things that usually go to mediation are more things. Professionalism is often about communication. Somebody is frustrated about the way an officer communicated with them, or did not communicate well with them. And neglect of duty, like I said, is thinking that somebody didn't do their job properly or didn't do what they were supposed to do. All of the complaints are referred to us through internal affairs, and then we do our own screening and intake process with the participants to make sure that it's appropriate for mediation, and also explaining the process, making sure that both participants understand what will happen in the room, and answering lots of questions that they have about the process. In our process, we have 2 mediators for each case, so everything's co-facilitated, and we try as best as possible to match the demographics of the mediators with the participants. There's been some research done that shows that if somebody looks like you at the table, you're more likely to have an honest and productive conversation. So we try to match demographics in terms of race, gender, and age as much as we can. We make pre-COVID, our mediations took place in community spaces. So public libraries would let us use their private meeting rooms, nonprofits would let us use their meeting rooms, community centers, rec centers. We wanted it to be neutral and community oriented. So not on anyone's turf, not ever at a police department, or not at anyone's home. So we make sure that the space is neutral and also at a time and place that's convenient to the participants. Both officer and community members are allowed to bring a support person if they'd like to sit at the table with them. And our sessions are 2 hours long. And then if people want to have additional sessions, they can schedule another one or as many as they'd like. But we cap it at 2 hours because that's about the time that a productive conversation starts to become less productive. And like I said, we use the inclusive model of mediation, which looks like asking open-ended questions, using what's called reflective listening. Like I said, our mediators are non-judgmental. And if the community member and the officer would like, there's a brainstorming process where they can actually come up with solutions and make agreements about how to move forward. I covered the venues that we use. Currently, since COVID, we've been doing mediations through Zoom. So we've been doing them online. But the best practice is to be in person, face-to-face, at a table. There is a lot that is important about that that's lost when we do virtual mediations, but it's the best that we can right now. So we've been doing them on Zoom, but once it is safe to gather again, and before COVID, we would always do them in person. So the mediators are recruited from the community. We do a training about every 2 years to recruit a new batch of mediators. And it's a competitive process. We put out a call for applications to the community and receive usually about 100 applications for 12 to 15 spots. So we've had great response from the community, interest from folks who want to do this work. They receive 50 hours of basic mediation training. It's an intense 6-day training. We bring down an awesome trainer from Maryland. Her name's Tracy Ford, and she's with Community Mediation Maryland, and she facilitates our trainings. Here's a couple pictures from some of the past groups. You'll see there are some uniformed officers pictured, and just to explain, the officers themselves are not mediators, but we do have 4 to 5 officers who participate in the training, mostly so that during the role plays, the new mediators get an opportunity to practice mediating with an actual officer at the table, to learn more about what that's like and learn more about the officers' perspectives, to better prepare them to be mediators. So we have officers who participate in the full training, and then they become ambassadors also to the program, so that other officers who are possibly interested in mediating can ask another officer about what it's like, and be able to get some answers to their questions. There's a few more pictures from our last training was in 2018. We've got one coming up. It was canceled because of COVID, but the next one is going to be outdoors and distanced in March. So we'll be training a new batch of 15 community members. But we have a pool of about 20 to 30 active mediators in the community at any one time, and they're specially trained for this particular program. They receive a stipend of $75 per case as well, but it's largely a volunteer effort. I'm going to skip over the sample case right now, but I'll definitely share these slides with Jessie so that she can send them out and folks can take a look. But a lot of times people ask, what does an actual mediation look like? What type of complaint would go to mediation? So I included a sample conflict scenario and some sample agreements that might be made in a mediation. So folks can take a look at that on their own if they're interested. And then this slide is really just to kind of talk about the fact that while mediations all are originally from a complaint that's about a specific incident, oftentimes the conversation that happens at the table does include lots of topics, lots of conversations. So it might be about, hey, I don't like the way that officer spoke to me when he pulled me over for a speeding ticket, but the conversation might end up talking about racism and biases within the community, violence in New Orleans, trauma, how to provide better mental health services. What does domestic violence response look like? What are the ideal ways to communicate with youth and parents when dealing with an incident? So I just wanted to give a sense of the kind of vastness of the conversations that take place in mediation. And, it really depends on the situation. Sometimes people have a very specific conversation about their incident, and sometimes they really get into deeper, more broad issues. So we do surveys after each mediation. All of the participants are asked to fill out a survey in the room, and then we also do a 30-day follow-up. And I've included a few statistics from some recent surveys from 2019. We haven't done the data yet for 2020. And also there's annual reports on our website from every year with all of the results from the surveys and more specifics if anyone is interested. But by and large, people have been very satisfied with the program. Most of the time, if people are not satisfied with their conversation, they still appreciate the opportunity that they had to have the conversation, but they might not necessarily feel good about how the officer behaved in the mediation, or they might not have gotten what they wanted out of the situation. That said, most people say that they prefer the mediation process to the traditional complaint investigation process. So compared to what would have happened if they had their complaint investigated, many times people are very appreciative of the fact that they had this option. I've included a few quotes that I think for the sake of time, I'll just leave these slides for folks to read over later. But we have lots of interesting and powerful quotes from both officers and community members about the value of the program and of the conversation and what they got out of it. And then the last few slides I have is to quickly just kind of touch on the fact that while this program, has been largely successful and we've received very positive feedback, there are also a lot of limitations and challenges to the work. One of the things that is most challenging is that civilians often do not wish to mediate. So I would say about 30 to 40% of the cases that are referred to mediation actually go to mediation. And it's usually the civilians who are not interested. At this point, I'd say 90% of officers say yes, and about 30 to 40% of civilians say yes. The reasons that they say no are varied. A lot of times people don't want to take the time or invest the emotional energy in a conversation with a police officer. Sometimes people fear retaliation. And in our screening process, if there's any fear of retaliation, we do not go forward with mediation. A lot of times people don't trust the process. They might be skeptical that anything will occur, that a change will happen. Also, a lot of times people have never heard of mediation, and there's a lot of sort of misunderstandings about what it looks like and what they'll get out of it. So that is a challenge. And then sometimes people really prefer the traditional investigation process. They say, I want this officer disciplined. I don't want to talk to them. I want someone else to handle it. So thank you. Also just wanted to mention the fact that there is obviously a power imbalance when you're mediating between officers and community members. You know, the officer is being paid for their time. The civilian is not. The mediations do occur during their normal shifts and they are on the clock. So that's big. We do our best to make it accessible to community members and really, you know, work with them to find a time and a place that's convenient. But at the end of the day, they're taking time out of their day to have this conversation, whereas officers, it's part of their job. And then obviously sitting at the table with a police officer who's in full uniform with a badge and gun can feel very intimidating, and not everybody wants to do that. I'd say that the civilians who do choose to go to mediation, you know, have a lot of courage to show up at the table, but that is something that not everybody wishes to do or feels comfortable doing. And we honor and respect that decision always. And then the idea of accountability is something that's big in terms of mediation. So a lot of times participants are not sure if the officer will be authentic. They say, you know, is this person just going to show up and kind of say what I want to hear? Will they really be open and honest? We do have officers who open up and are very vulnerable at the table, and we have officers who are not. And there's no guarantee that you're going to get what you want when you go to mediation. There's also no guarantee that you'll get what you want with the traditional complaint investigation process. But I think it's important to note that folks don't know, you know, what kind of conversation they'll have. And then also the agreements that are made, you know, one of the beauties of mediation is that people get to make their own outcomes, but at the same time, there's not somebody who's going to ensure that those agreements are kept. The mediators do include a lot of guidance in terms of like getting details about how to make sure the agreements are kept. But at the end of the day, there's not a body that's going to enforce them. And then restrictions from the NOPD policy and unions. Basically, without going into too much detail, because I know we're getting short on time here, the idea of the mediation program is that it's an alternative to the investigation process. So you can either have your complaint investigated or mediated, but not both. And that's something that a lot of times people don't want to take the risk of doing mediation. I wish that we could do both. There's a lot of people who wish that we could do both, but we are restricted by policies. And at this point, the unions and the leadership at NOPD feel that doing both mediation and an investigation would be sort of like double jeopardy, where the officer is being asked to be held accountable twice. There's also certain restrictions in terms of the timeline and eligibility, since we are working within the disciplinary review process. We've worked with them to make sure that those restrictions are as flexible as possible, but we still have to work within them. And then also there's something to be said for this being part of a formal complaint process, which a lot of times I think people would like to have a conversation with an officer, but they either don't know how or don't want to take the time to go through with filing a formal complaint. And so I'd say that's a limitation that keeps some people from having the conversation that they'd like to have. And then my last bullet point is something that I think you all have been talking about in this group, which is the idea of police reform versus abolition or defunding. And oversight agencies like the one that I work for are oftentimes seen, and they're complicated. So in some ways they are working to, you know, make sure officers are being held accountable, but in other ways, you know, they are doing things that are considered reform-based rather than abolition-based. So things like body-worn cameras and, you know, asking officers to have more trainings and civilian oversight boards, like they often are seen as not radical enough, that's reinforcing police legitimacy rather than taking money and putting it into the community, into other programs, and focusing on how to take power away from the police. So that's a big conversation, a complicated one. But I think it's important to point out that while the mediation program is attempting to be more radical and more alternative and having a restorative justice philosophy behind it, it still exists within an oversight agency, and that does have its limitations, especially in terms of, a lot of the conversations that we're having now about budgets and policy and, really how can we have true accountability for the community. So on that note, I will just say that I put a few websites here on a last slide in case folks want to look up more information. I have our program website. Community Mediation Maryland has a lot of excellent resources about the inclusive model of mediation that we use. There's a PDF, the Community Police Mediation Guide is something that talks about community police mediation specifically, was put together, I think in 2002, so it might be a little bit outdated, but it gives a good overview of sort of the ins and outs of why this type of program was created. And then the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, which is also called NACOL, is sort of the national organization of oversight agencies, and there's lots of resources on their website about police oversight in general. And on that note, I will leave you with my contact information. I'm still out on maternity leave until January, so my colleague Gahiji is fielding questions about the program right now. So this is his information. I put my work email there as well. I'd be happy to get back to you in January, but I'm not checking that email right now. And there's also our website and also the organization website. So, okay, I ran a little bit over. I want to make sure there's time for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I guess, Jesse, hand it back to you to facilitate this part, or how does this work?
Yeah. I'm going to recommend that everyone write their questions in the chat. I have found that usually gets us through the Q&A a little bit quicker since we're a little short on time. Jules, thank you so much for that presentation. It was very helpful and I think gives us a lot to think about. One thing that either slipped my mind or maybe I didn't say late enough, and we have a few CCA folks on this call, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but to the best of my knowledge, CCA does not have a mediation program, correct? So we don't do in Cincinnati a formal or an informal like mediation process. I think the complaints Jules was talking about, professionalism or the types of complaints that are eligible for mediation. I believe, if I'm still correct, that those complaints are transferred to CPD instead of CCA. So I think that's something that is being floated in a lot of conversations about what CCA could do differently. If I'm wrong about that, if anyone from CCA tonight wants to give a better explanation in the chat or talk about it, go for it.
Yeah, I can just say a little bit. We handle severe complaints, but a lot of times in the course of the investigation, the discourtesy, charge comes up as well. So even though the complaint was registered as a use of force or an improper search, if our investigator sees that there's discourtesy or some lower level infraction, then that's included in the investigation. So while we don't, I think it's called CCRP, and Jesselyn and Kim Neal could probably answer better, or Luz, Elena. So we do get to those at times, but if it comes in simply as a discourtesy, that's handled by I think it's CCRP. And Kim or Jesselyn, you can correct me.
Yep, Kim just seconded that in the chat to me, said that their mediation program is called CCRP, but I'm not sure if it's as I don't want to say casual, but as restorative justice based, as what Jules described. And I think probably we at some point will want to have a follow-up conversation with this group about Cincinnati's model. And so we definitely, if you have any Cincinnati specific questions, since we only have 40 minutes left and we have Jules with us now, I didn't want to get us too far off topic there, but all of these questions that have poured in, I will read them, and Jules, if you can answer. One that I got from Bob that I thought was a good one are what types of agreements result from mediation? What would be an agreement that is made?
Sure. And I think I see a message from Bob that says approximately what percentage result in an agreement, what kinds of agreements, and are any of them made public or reported up the line of authority? Mm-hmm. So the model of mediation that we work within, actually, how do I describe it? There's no, there's no requirement for an agreement to happen. And agreements can look very different. We kind of want participants to get what they want out of it. So sometimes people want an apology, sometimes people want to make an agreement, and sometimes they just want to be heard. I would say probably about 75% of mediations result in like a positive outcome where people feel satisfied with the conversation. I would say about 25% of the time, the community member usually is frustrated that the officer did not show up in the way that they hoped. The kinds of agreements that result can be anything from, like I said, an apology to very specific things like, depends on the situation, but it can be like, that this officer will attend a community meeting to learn more about the community that they are working in so that they understand better the dynamics and behave in a certain way that the community member would like to see. Sometimes it's specific things like, how to communicate better, that this person will, pause and take a deep breath before they respond, or that they will talk to a mom before they talk to the kid because the mom is frustrated that they didn't feel heard in the situation. If you look at the slides that I'll send out, there's some sample agreements about a conflict scenario that kind of give a better idea. Sometimes it's, about communication, like, hey, this detective really needs to call me back. I keep trying to give information or get information and they won't call me back. So an agreement could look like, Detective so-and-so calls back within 48 hours of receiving a message, or that the participant and the officer are going to share contact information and make a plan about how they're going to communicate going forward about information that's necessary for a case. In terms of agreements being made public, they are not. It is all confidential. The participants can decide if they would like to add in some extra level of accountability. So sometimes they decide that a supervisor needs to be brought into the scenario. So, and that if both participants agree, okay, officer so-and-so is going to, give me a supplemental report for this traffic incident that I'm requesting, and I need their supervisor to sign off on it, they can decide together that the supervisor will, follow up in 1 week or in 2 weeks or something like that. Does that answer the question, Bob? I don't know if you're with us, but that's a little bit. And
I'm with you. Yes, yes. Thank you very much. That is exactly what I was looking for. Thanks.
But we sort of see all mediations that result in a mediation as like a success. So we don't say if somebody is, just coming to the table in our model would result in, what we would say is like a successful mediation. We don't require a specific outcome of it.
Right.
I'm seeing some more questions. Jesse, should I just go ahead and, oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was talking to myself, I guess. I was wondering if you could jump to Anne Marie's question about not being specific rules for mediation, like letting someone yell, how that might close off progress and what your experience with that is?
Sure. So we we kind of believe, or the model of mediation that we use believes that, like, if people are told how to communicate, or if, if the mediator is saying, hey, you need to speak like this, and kind of like is trying to even the playing field, that as soon as they walk out the door, the playing field's going to go right back like this. And so people need to communicate how they communicate, and they need to come to the table as they are, and work through that. And the mediators are trained to facilitate that. So if somebody's yelling, the police officer might be, let's say a community member is yelling, police officer might be fine with that. If the police officer says, ma'am, please, can you not talk like that? Ma'am, I can't communicate with you like this. The mediator will facilitate a conversation where the officer and the community member can decide how they want to communicate with each other, but the mediator themselves is not going to say, you have to stop yelling, you can't talk like that. They basically have tools to facilitate the conversation in a way where, whatever the officer and the participant need to communicate will be talked about, but the mediator themselves will not dictate that. So yes, definitely somebody yelling can shut down a process. However, if the mediator says stop doing it, that's sort of against our idea that the participant should really own the conversation. And so the officer can say, ma'am, I listen to you, now you need to listen to me. And they'll kind of work through that, and the facilitator will help them work through it, but they're not there to determine how somebody needs to speak. Some people are fine yelling. I've sat through mediations where the entire time for 2 hours people just yell on top of each other, and they still get a lot out of it. You'd be surprised at what kinds of communication works for people and what doesn't. So the mediators are very trained to pull out all of the important pieces. So I can listen to two people yell at each other for an hour and then come back with a very, calm and kind of collected, okay, so it sounds like this is important to you, that's important to you, and you're looking for this and that, is that right? And they can say, yeah, exactly. So the mediators are highly trained to deal with those circumstances. And also, if people want to end the process at any time, they can. So they can walk out, they can leave, they can say, I don't want to deal with this anymore. When we say it's voluntary, we mean it's voluntary all the way through. So nobody is forced to stay at the table.
Thanks, Jules. Going off of that a little bit, Kim was wondering to what degree an officer's supervisor has about what an officer can agree to in an agreement, or I guess at any point in the process, how much authority they might have over the officer if they're there on the clock.
So supervisors are always aware that the mediation is happening. Like when we email the officers the invitation to mediation, their supervisor is copied as well as the district commander. So people know that the mediation is happening, and they approve it. They have to sign off on it, but they're not usually there in the room unless they're brought as a support person. If they're brought as a support person, they're usually a non-speaking observer role, and that's because we want the people who were involved in the conflict to be able to speak for themselves. If the supervisor was involved in the scenario, then they can speak. And if the participants agree that it would be helpful for a supervisor to be there, sometimes people ask for that. And we kind of work on a consent model where if, let's say, a civilian says, well, I really want the supervisor to be there because he was the one who made the call, then I would check with the officer and say, are you okay with the supervisor being there? I check with the supervisor. Are you interested in being there? They all kind of come together and agree that that's what they want. So sometimes supervisors can be very helpful because they can give information that, maybe the rank and file officer didn't know. Sometimes they can also be very unhelpful because officers might not be as honest or willing to engage kind of vulnerably in front of their supervisor. So it can kind of go a lot of different ways. There's been times where, the supervisor's like kind of yelling at the officer, come on, talk more. You have to talk more. And that can be helpful and also unhelpful. So it really goes a lot of different ways. But the supervisors are not automatically included in the actual mediation session itself.
Thanks. I'm going to do 2 more questions. So if you have others, We will have a short, small group discussion, so you can bounce them off members of your group or save them for a follow-up event. But one question, the first one is, Mark noticed that there was a slide that said only about 30% of police officers thought that this was something that was helping them to do their job better. I'm not sure, I didn't catch that statistic, so I'm not sure if that is the slide. But do you have any thoughts about that and what that might mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, I mean, there's a lot of different questions about that we ask on the survey. You know, did this make you understand the community better? Does this give you a better sense of what the community is looking for? Usually they will say yes to those questions. And oftentimes, you know, officers say, I learned so much about this person or about the community. Officers, as a culture, I'd say police officers are very slow to say, I could have done something better. It's just not in their makeup. I think we as humans are often very slow to say I could have done something better, and police officers are like a very extreme example of that. They all often are saying, you know, I still did my job, you know, and I would say that a lot of times the culture of policing is often about, and I'd say the culture of discipline and accountability that we learn, I think, in our country is often about breaking rules. So a lot of times the officer will say, I didn't break any rules. I did my job right. But doing your job right and doing something well, or something that like takes into account somebody's humanity or takes into account like, you know, some nuances of the situation are different. So a lot of times they might not have actually broken a policy or rule, but they might have said something very nasty and that was very hurtful, or they might have done something that was, you know, that was viewed as very nasty or hurtful. So I think one of the beauties of mediation is that, you know, there's a lot of nuance that doesn't happen when you're just looking at breaking the rules or doing your job right. So a lot of times I think that survey question is an interesting one, because I think officers are very slow to say, yeah, I could have done something better. But if you dig a little bit deeper and look at some of the other questions, they often will say that they learned a lot and that they, you know, they could have like done this or that as well. But they're quick to, or they're slow to admit wrongdoing. Although it depends. I've seen officers straight up say, you know what, I messed up. I was having a bad day. I was stressed about this, this, and this, and I could have done better. So we do see it. It depends.
Thanks. The final question is that I'm going to pose, and hopefully this can help take us into our small group discussion. It's something that Paul asked, and I want to sort of broaden it a little bit. He asked how mediation could have played a role in a situation like, I'm assuming he means preventing something like the George Floyd incident from happening. And I guess I'm just a little more curious to hear your perspective on, you know, even if 100% of people commit to mediation and every single mediation has a positive outcome or a good agreement is reached, what are the limitations and what are the sort of things that we still need to have in place to sort of bridge the gap? If that makes sense.
I think what mediation is really useful for, and what makes it very powerful, is that it gives an opportunity for individuals to hear from each other and to see each other as human and to learn about each other beyond the conceptions that they have, both of the community having perceptions of officers and officers having perceptions of the community. So, you know, I've seen officers really come out of a mediation saying, wow, you know, I kind of judged this person in this way, and it turns out they're not what I thought. And, you know, I see them as more than the stereotype that I assumed, or I see them as just more of a human. Because officers will say, quite frankly, I see a lot of people all day long and I stop seeing their humanity. And this process has helped me remember the person behind the call. And it's helped me remember that this person is having a very serious thing happen when they call the police, and I need to like remember the person. So I think individuals learning about other individuals can absolutely, you know, absolutely bring more empathy and more understanding and change behavior. I think absolutely, if you see somebody in a certain way, you will behave differently now that you have thought of them that way. That said, I think systemically and culturally and politically and like policy wise, I think, there's certain things that absolutely need to change in our police in our policing system in the country, in every city. And I think there's policies that need to happen. I think there's accountability that needs to happen on a federal level, in the courts, right? So yes, you can mediate and have more empathy for people, and also you need to be held accountable. At the end of the day, officers are murdering people and getting away with it without any kind of accountability, and that means something. So, I think it's not an either or. I think it's both and. I think mediation can be very powerful in changing behavior, especially at an individual level. And we need all kinds of change in terms of our funding, our policies, our training, and also just the fact that officers are being called out to scenes that they shouldn't be at in the very first place. And I think that would actually make a lot of change in and of itself. Just kind of that defund abolition conversation.
Thanks so much. I know we didn't get through every single question. I'm sorry if you had an amazing question that we aren't able to get to, but we are running behind schedule per usual because we always have such amazing speakers, which is a good problem to have. But I do want to be respectful of your time. So we're going to move to a small group discussion, and we'll discuss 2 different questions in small groups for about 20 minutes. And I will post these questions in the chat. So the first one talks about the core values of restorative justice, being providing people space to speak for themselves and be heard and come up with solutions on their own. Restorative justice also views crime as more than just breaking the law. It focuses more on the harm that is done to people, relationships, and the community. So with that model of restorative justice in mind, the question is, what do you see as the benefits of using these approaches for police accountability? And what do you see as some limitations? So that's the first question. And let me make sure I'm sending this to everyone. And then the second question is a little more personal. So it is, if you had the opportunity to sit down and have a face-to-face facilitated conversation with a Cincinnati police officer, would you be inclined to take it in the first place? Jules mentioned that a lot of folks opt out of mediation. Maybe that's in favor of pursuing an investigation, or maybe they just don't want to deal with it. So would you take that opportunity? And if you would, what is it that you would like to share? So what kind of things would you ask them? What would you want them to know about you and your community? And if you wouldn't take the opportunity, why would you not take it? So that is the second question. I have a feeling that we are probably not going to have enough time for every single person to share their thoughts on both of these questions. So whatever your group is able to get to, that's perfectly fine. There are a few folks who I've asked to facilitate conversations and take some notes if possible, just to keep us on track. So I'll try and have one informal small group discussion facilitator in all of your groups. So give me 1 second and I will break us out.
And Jesse, I'm just going to sign off here and say thank you to everybody. Please feel free to email further questions to myself or my colleague Gahiji, and I'd be happy to answer when I'm back at work in January, or he can absolutely answer in the meantime. And I'll send the PowerPoint to Jesse. I know somebody asked if the slides will be shared, and she can absolutely share that out. And just thank you again, everyone, for having me.
Thanks.
Have a good evening.
Jules.
We're the only ones that left our breakout session.
Hi, everyone. All right, we've got a small surviving group, but that's okay. In the next few minutes that we have, we could just take like 20 seconds, 30 seconds to share about what we talked about in each of our groups, and then I will close us out, so I won't hold you any longer than I've already promised. But does anyone want to share? I think we had 4 breakout groups.
Jesse, I'll quickly.
Just like my class, Jesse, nobody wants to talk when I ask them if they.
What'd you say?
It's like my class at school. Nobody, if
Okay.
you have to call on someone. You have to say, hey, somebody say something.
Yeah, Zoom is probably worse than in person, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm done with that now. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've still got 3 more classes. Our group talked about a bunch of things, and I think one of the things that was interesting, at least from my perspective, is the idea that currently most of the situations are from something that happened very recently. And yet I know in my experience, in the back of my mind is something that happened with a police officer, 15 years ago. And that flavors my future interaction, present feelings about police in general, because I never had the opportunity for it to get resolved in any way. I mean, it turns out it was a police officer who was in a police car. We never talked to each other. We never got out of our cars, but he did something really bad, in my opinion. But, these things, I think that kind of a resolution would help your attitude and many other people's attitude. And so it would be very useful.
Jesse, I just want to say very quickly, we certainly talked about the limitations and the benefits, but one of the things that Cynthia mentioned was the power of the story, the power of being able to relate this story and being heard, and the other side to be able to hear it.
When we were talking, I think the 3 of us pretty much agreed that, for the 3 of us sitting across from another police officer, probably wouldn't be that big a deal. I did think that these police officers have guns while you're talking with them is not a level playing field at all. And I just think that could be cleaned up. I mean, I'm sure they could put their guns somewhere that it wasn't with them right at the time, but that's not a good part of that. There's a police officer that I see in City Hall all the time with a gun, and he's in plain clothes, but he has his gun, and it's not hidden. It's where everybody can see it. And there are plenty of officers on duty that have guns. There's no reason for that, but I think he just has that there just as a sign that, to intimidate people. So I think that could be something a little different that could be maybe positive for some folks.
Anyone from my group want to share?
I'll share. I mean, I think, we talked around the topic a bit, and, I'll hold my hand up as a resident cynic in this type of thing, just from a lack of outcome or just, overall responsibility taking. But, Jesse made some good points about, it doesn't hurt. And it's a part of bridging a divide that we see in many different urban centers around the country, where you've got community members and you've got officers, and you don't have any communication at all between them. So, whether you have the collaborative community-based, policing method, or you have the ability to, do this mediation process, I think, like the speaker said, it's kind of an both and. So if it doesn't hurt, I guess, even a cynic like me can say, that might be a good thing to do.
I would agree, Mark, in the sense that I'm cynical about it too, and I'm on the board. But I've seen, and Jesselyn can confirm this. We make recommendations that are good recommendations that make sense to everybody. And in the next month, I'll read the same recommendation again. And Jesselyn would say, I continue to recommend that we not do this or that we change this thing. But there's no follow-up from the police department. So in Cincinnati, what we're going to try to do and what we're moving towards doing is trying to have better communication between our office and the police department and the city manager's office, and what their responses are to our recommendations. Because the city manager, from the whole time I've been on the board, it's been 2 years or so, city managers agreed with all of our recommendations. But then there seems to be a misstep there in getting that to the police officers in the police department, and getting them to go along with that. So Mark, when you say you're a skeptic, it's tough. And just mediation, that's a thing that might help those two individuals. But in the system, there's got to be more accountability to the public. And so that's what we're going to hope to do in Cincinnati in the next couple of years.
Well, I thank you and any of the other CCA, people associated with what's going on in the city. I would just point out, never been anti-police in my life, but you know what? This is what budgetary and contract negotiations are all about. If you want any teeth for anything, they have to be a part of that and understanding that. So I do hope that city managers also think about that.
Well, that and the union contract, which the negotiations are, I think, up in March or May. So I mean,
it's coming up, I think.
That has to be part of our push as well, is in that realm. So there's a lot that we could do that we're going to try to do. But the bureaucracy of an aircraft carrier, it doesn't turn easily, but we're going to keep pushing.
Hey, Mark, could you send something to Jessie that she could forward out to the group to say, here is some of the challenges that are faced here by the CCA, and here are things you could do, letters that you could write, and who you could write it to.
Zeke and I can talk more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know who that would be. And I think all of us would have an interest in saying, if we could nudge that along in some way, what do we have to do?
Well, the simplistic, if you just look at the diagram of power and authority, we give our recommendations to the city manager. The city manager is hired by city council. The city manager should be the boss of the police chief. Should be able to tell the police chief, I want this to be done. And the police chief would do it or would suffer the consequences for not doing it. So in my position, what I think the board is the group that needs to push from the political side, because city council is by the charter, it hires and fires the manager. Now the mayor comes in there too, but there needs to be an outreach, I think, to city council, which is what I've started to do and what we're going to continue to do, is lobby city council for a little more teeth in what we're doing, and or at least tell the manager they can't just agree with what we say and not implement it. If the manager wants to not agree, by the charter, by the Article 28, the manager has to explain what it is that they disagree with about our recommendations. And so there's a dialogue there that we can, but that, in my experience, hasn't happened. So I'm happy to talk with Jessie about that and figure out some things that the public can do to help, because we need help.
Yeah, I think this topic is definitely something that we want to keep exploring and having conversations about, just like this. So Jesselyn and Zeke and everyone involved tonight, I would just say stay tuned and hopefully we can keep this going. I don't know what December is going to look like because I know a lot of us are feeling burnout, and the end of the year is always hard to schedule things. So stay tuned for something in January for sure. But I'll definitely be sending a follow-up email with the presentation and a few other resources to pass along. So look for that. Thanks for coming, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.